Thank you very much, Leah and Brett, for being with us here today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Now, your book, How Far Can We Go?, offers readers, as the subtitle suggests, a Catholic guide to sex and dating. So can you tell us a bit about who you expect these readers to be and how the book came about?
It's aimed at young people, but also anyone who works with young people.
Mm-hmm.
That means Catholic school teachers, youth workers, pastors, and actually we really hope a lot of parents read it. We find parents sometimes not comfortable talking about this, and this can really be a good introduction for parents,
right,
for something to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably a good segue into how it came about. I mean, we just, over time, as we were asking the question, how far can we go as young people, we started to become the references among our colleagues and friends, and we're two of the people who I guess are comfortable talking about sex and dating with young people, and so we just started doing that and
mm-hmm.
having opportunities to speak in churches and schools.
Now, with regards to the content of the book, we'll begin with a very general, wide open question, and that is, what is sex? In today's society, we're led to believe that it's something purely physical, but that's not it entirely.
Well, there's something about a human person that means that nothing is purely physical. Like if you think about someone who gets sick, right, is diagnosed with cancer, and you can think about it as a purely sort of physical aspect, what you can, discover with the sciences or whatever. But you know that there's so much more involved in a person, that when something that big happens, there's emotional involvement, spiritual involvement, all that kind of stuff. And that's the same with everything. So something as powerful as sex, the way it impacts people, and we see that it has like life-changing significance for people. There's no way to make it purely physical. And when you try to strip it down to that, you do damage to it and you do damage to yourself. So if a human person can't do something in a purely physical way.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that we often don't recognize is that sex as an action is an expression of something that's much deeper and broader. For people, our sexuality is what drives us into all human relationships. It's what makes us care about and love other people. Mm-hmm. And so it can't be reduced to one action, let alone just one part of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is power in sex, but in two very different ways. And the first is the society's perception of sex, what they think sex can achieve, but also God's intentions for sex. Can you talk to us a bit about what the difference is between this?
Sure. Donna Friatis is a young woman at Boston College, and she did an incredibly interesting study in the last couple of years of American secular, Protestant, and Catholic universities. And what she discovered was that tons of places, students are saying dating has basically been replaced by hooking up, having physical intimacy with virtually strangers that may eventually develop into a relationship, but not always. But what she discovered when she talked to those students was that they don't want to hook up. They want romance and relationships, and they want to be married and have families. I mean, across all of these different campuses, they want the same thing. And so what she discovered is that people aren't telling them how to do that, so they just kind of fall into society's habit of hooking up. We think in some ways the church is similar to society in that we paint a vision. We say, yes, you want marriage and family, and we don't want you to have sex before you get married, but we don't often talk about how we do that. How do we get from being a stranger with someone to having a spouse? Mm-hmm. And so we're particularly interested in responding to the how. How do we get there? And thus the title of the book. How far can we go? What are we trying to do to build meaningful relationships that will lead us into healthy, holy, lifelong marriages?
Right. Now, in your speaking ministry, and even in the preparation for writing this book, what did you find was the biggest assumption or misunderstanding about Catholic teaching on sexuality?
I think a lot of people inside the church and outside the church think that Catholic sexual ethics is basically about a set of rules. Mm-hmm. And when rules are divorced from what you're trying to be and become as a person, they get totally abstract and they become a terrible burden, really. Catholic ethics in general and sexual ethics specifically is about discipleship. It's about becoming a person that you want to be. It's about growing in holiness. It's about being a disciplined person. Disciplined people are happy people. How many times do you say, oh, I wish I hadn't have done that? That this thing that seemed like a good idea at the time, right, doesn't lead to happiness. So I think we should frame things in terms of creating people of virtue and people of freedom. And that means that there's some things that are a bad idea because they inhibit your freedom. But we shouldn't frame it as here's the list of nots.
Are people receptive to that? Or is this an uphill battle? Because we are living in a society that is saturated with sex and its images. And so how do you convey this message to young people and make it appealing?
I think for us, lots of our relationships with people in the church and outside the church, we handle them the same way. I mean, we're meeting people where they're at, but we're also doing it in a slightly different way. I mean, our biggest battle with secular culture is indifference. People will listen to what we have to say, but thanks, that's not for me. Mm-hmm. But we don't start with, we don't approve of what you're doing. We start with, where do you want to be? Mm-hmm. And in the church and outside the church, most people say, I want to have healthy relationships. I want to be a parent and a grandparent, or I want to be a world traveler. I mean, and then we start working backwards. If that's what you want in secular terms, or where God is calling you in Catholic terms, how are you going to get there?
But does a teenager understand that? Because when you look at the big picture of the church teaching and the message that you're conveying in this book, dating is about discernment, about preparation for marriage. But a teenager just wants to date. They just want to go out and have fun. So how do you get them to see that big picture?
Some of the reaction we've got from the book from teens has been like, thank goodness someone put it this way. This is a freeing way to look at it. We haven't heard this at school or from whoever is sort of representing church teaching to us, and it's a liberating feeling that they have. But in terms of the seriousness of a dating relationship when you're a teenager, part of what we do in this book is look at the fact that not all relationships are at the same level of seriousness, right? A couple of grade 9s or 10s who are getting to know each other aren't in the same kind of relationship as an engaged couple. And you don't have to marry everyone you date. I mean, the point is to figure things out and share yourself at a level that's appropriate for where you are. So a big part of the book is getting people to answer, where am I at? What kind of relationship is this? We would say, if you know for sure you can't marry someone, don't waste your time. Dating, right? You're going to get hurt. But if you don't have to panic on the third date, oh, I don't know if I can marry them. Right? Especially if you're a long ways from being married because of school issues or family issues or whatever your situation. It doesn't mean you can't date. It just means be appropriate with the kind of relationship you're in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also about keeping in mind that it's not enough just to say no. I mean, that's usually what teens hear, just don't have sex. But it's also about learning when to say yes and what you're saying yes to. When in fact you should say yes, that God is calling you into this and it's an exciting and life-giving future for both of you. It's about protecting what is holy. So there's no problem with having fun, enjoying the gifts that God gives us. But we want to do it in a way that doesn't hurt us for future relationships. Right. And so, I mean, teenage years are wonderful years of figuring out who you are, who God's calling you to be. Mm-hmm. And you do that in all kinds of relationships. Dating can be part of that as long as it's not going to be destructive dating.
Right. Now, I think in your answer you kind of alluded to the intimacy model that you discuss in your book. Can you give us a brief summary of what that model is and how it can be used for young people who are in dating relationships?
The basic model is an idea of growth in intimacy. We talked earlier about a lot of the Catholic books that are quite theoretical. They give a beautiful picture of what the goal is, right? What Catholic marriage should look like or Christian marriage should look like. What we do is we step back and say, okay, so how do I get from A to B? We say, how do you get from stranger to spouse? Relationships need to grow in intimacy and in commitment over time. That's healthy, that's natural. How do you do that? And we say one way you can take a healthy progression is by looking at your relationship in much broader terms. The question that's the title of the book, How Far Can We Go, is usually asked to mean physically. What can we do physically? And that's okay to ask that question. It's an important question, but the answer comes from what kind of relationship am I in? What am I doing socially? How much am I giving emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually? And when you look at yourself and learn how to discover your relationship in those other aspects, the physical just needs to sort of parallel the developments there. People get in trouble with relationships and get hurt when the physical starts outstripping the spiritual or the emotional content in a relationship. And then people get hurt. But what's marriage? It's the fullness of all of those, right? So if you're working towards the fullness of gift of yourself, you need to be able to reference all those parts of a relationship to stay in a healthy and balanced relationship.
Now you say in your book, the Christian life is about growing in virtue, and I think we too rarely consider sexuality as helping us become virtuous. So how do we change that way of thinking? How do we make a more logical connect between the two?
I think the beginning is being aware that it's not just about rules, what we talked about before. Virtue is about becoming a certain kind of person. Rules are in place with that goal in mind. Rules are never an end in themselves. So making growing into the kind of person who makes good decisions spontaneously because they've developed habits and practices of discipline. Being able to make free decisions because you're not drawn in by every impulse, because you're able to say, what's best for me, what's best for other people in this relationship. That's what a person of virtue can do. And it can become almost automatic. I mean, that's what a saint is, right? A saint is someone who's just had this sort of automatic, I know what a person is and what a person needs and how to respond to a person.
John Paul II in Theology of the Body talks about how spontaneity is not doing whatever we want to. And I think our culture really misses that. He says true spontaneity is when we do what God calls us to because it's the desire of our heart. And so there's this place in what we're doing that says, whether it's about sexuality or about the way we treat the poor or how we reach out to somebody who's being bullied or how we respond to our parents, when we do what's right because we want to, that's when we know we've arrived, right?
Now, as we've mentioned, this did begin as a speaking ministry. So you've had a lot of interaction with young people and their parents as you present this to them. How have they responded to the message that you're giving to them? And based on that, what you've seen and heard from them, what advice would you give to teachers, parents, ministers who need to be the ones who are conveying the message or teaching young people?
The response has been really positive. Like, a lot of things that we hear are, I forced my kid to go to this, right? You guys were coming to talk to the youth group, and I forced them to go, and I had to promise that we weren't going to talk about sex at all, right? But then all the way home in the car and late into the night, we talked. So one thing is being able to have language and understand your kid's experience so that you can talk to them and understand what their concerns are.
Yeah, generally I think, we wouldn't have jobs and have an opportunity to do this work if people didn't feel somewhat uncomfortable. We're not the best people to do this work. And so we prefer family catechesis opportunities because we recognize that kids need to be in relationships with people who are going to be formative in this area. Right. So, we're providing a tool. But I usually say two things to parents and teachers who are a bit nervous. First, you have to do your own work. Many of them feel uncomfortable because they haven't thought about how their experience of dating and finding marriage can be translated, right? Perhaps they didn't follow the church's teaching, they don't know what to say, the culture has changed, but they need to figure out how their experience is a reflection of God's grace in their lives so that they can share that with authenticity. And then the other thing is that making sure that they're interested in the other areas of their kids' dating lives is really essential. So if when your kids come home from dates, the first thing you say is, "Did you make out?" the kids feel reduced to their sexuality. It's the same problem as when a guy looks at a girl's chest when he talks to her instead of her face. Start by asking about how your kids' relationships are socially, what their friends think, what their friends think about how they're dealing with emotions in their relationship, how they deal with sharing the things they've learned and what they're excited about. And that's a good way in to the dialogue. And then it shouldn't start when they start dating. It should be starting with healthy relationship discussions when they're 2 and 5 and 7 and 12, so that it's not a surprise.
Right.
Well, thank you both very much for sharing this advice, this information, both here today and in your book. Thank you. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.
Julie.